I'm probably too tired to be making this kind of recording, but anyway, I was having such an interesting discussion with people that had me channeling these ideas that I've had pent up and that I've expressed in some of my recordings, but that came through so, or at least in my own, to my own perspective, cogently in the context of the discussion. But there were larger aspects which I couldn't import into it because then I would have had to sort of monopolize and lay out like a whole structure, and the discussion was drawing to an end, and it was essentially everyone's bedtime as well. Anyway, and I certainly didn't have the energy to set up all those other sort of things. Anyway, um, so I guess I want to talk about it. So, man. So I'm kind of thinking to myself, this is what I would have said to continue the conversation and to explore it deeper. And sadly, there are like four tangents that I want to add, which I think all are important sort of things, because what was coming up in some sense was also a clash of worldviews or an exploration of different worldviews. And I was essentially trying to debunk the worldview that I was coming up against. Because I do think it's problematic. But anyway, the horrible thing is that to explore such a thing is you have to almost make an ad hominem sort of takedown of it, or at least I often do, because I ground all of my philosophical thinking and political thinking in libertarianism, and so essentially, whenever someone doesn't agree with me, in some sense, my to kind of aggregate my general sort of retort is essentially culminates in being, you're not willing to burden the requisite responsibility, and you're trying to generalize it or something like that. And anyway, I should, so I don't know if I want to give background to this or just kind of try to make this a standalone thing, both of which I think it's not going to be easy for me to do. I mean, I would add this on to my series of the ideal society or something like that. Anyway, the topic centered around sex work, uh, from someone who has first hand knowledge, and who is somewhat of an advocate, uh, you know, uh, being within the field and having first hand knowledge, and also perhaps able to articulate some of the at least some of the potential ways in which things can be improved, but um, their general worldview, I think, is does have a kind of contradiction in it, or there are problems in it, and essentially in the um, quest to overcome, let's say, these two general hurdles, as they see it, one being uh, criminalization and the other one generally being stigma. Uh, this is where I say I certainly want it legal. I don't want it to be criminalized, but I don't want it to be criminalized for almost cynical and even hypocritical reasons, which I will get into. Um, and I'm not that on board with essentially the stigma being entire. I do think a lot of the stigma, for the same reason that I want it decriminalized, I think a lot of the stigma is illegitimate. Um, but some of the stigma I think is valid. And that's not an easy thing to articulate because it is a complicated thing. And let me just give you some of the measure of of essentially the complexity and the nuance which I'm taking into this issue. So essentially, somehow it works out that that stigma is the last barrier that society has against, for instance, coercive parents or horrible conditions that people find themselves in, to take the whole collective society to the point of I'm just trying to think of a metaphor. There's sort of two ways of casting this as a kind of a moralistic blackmail, or sort of being held hostage in order to, after having legalized sex work, that then the only way to um, clean up the moral gray area, which has now been, let's say, permitted by the state, the only way to clean up that moral gray area is to further banish all forms of coercion within society. So that effectively, essentially, the idea of essentially soft forms of compulsion would not amount to the system raping individual women who would be subjecting themselves to sex work in order to escape any uh, discomfort. And in some sense, I mean, let's just say the example of, let's say, the depraved situation in which parents would coerce their child into sex work in order to um, generate an income stream from their child. That now society somehow is on the hook for cleaning up every avenue of moral deficit in order to preserve, essentially, let's say, the general libertarian legal framework, or which is essentially contained within the principles, the values, and the, let's say, the societal structures, which, let's just say, generally amount to private property. And that's my shorthand of saying capitalism, in some sense, that essentially then um, somehow the government has to make sure that everything is fair for everyone, and kind of entrench and enforce some kind of fairness for the individual, in which the relations between parent and child become a diminutive arrangement that is buttressed by the state, and therefore the realm of autonomy and self-determinism is only left a frivolous pursuit, as nanny government installs safety rails and chases after everyone um, to provide some kind of policed culture of providing comfort collaterally between these almost infantilized citizens. So essentially, the individual gets demoted into a kind of pre-primary school child, um, like a kindergarten school child in some sense. Um, and so essentially, the kindness that government is expected to ensure to the individual ends up becoming the explanation for why people don't learn to establish that uh, or organize it in a way that is at least independent of the state's functioning. Um, so it no longer becomes a cultural vestige. Um, it becomes essentially an arm of a culture that has become wholly um, adjunct to the political sphere. And that is in a sense becomes, I mean, that's roughly my definition of a totalitarian society in which politics governs culture. Um, although in this kind of synthesis it has been achieved by adding a demand for libertarian license and permissiveness from the state, and then um, doubling back on that demand and saying we need sympathy uh, delivered along with this liberty. So, in some sense, not being able to bootstrap the principle that if you demand a freedom, that you need to be willing to bear that freedom or burden that freedom um, without a collateral claim for so it's like you want to bill the government for what you for after you want to bill the government in perpetuity for delivering to you the liberty that you would demand of it. And in some sense, this sets up what I would generally call, and this is a bit ad hominem, and I apologize for this, I don't mean this in a mean spirited way, but it is a way to kind of create a metaphor, is that we have this idea of the artist, the starving, let's rather say, someone who wants to attain the merit and the status of a heart, and they wish to have the heart of a starving artist, but they're not willing to starve for it. They're not prepared to starve in order to uh, have this uh, uh, the status accorded to them by the system. And in some sense, I think that there is an externalization and perhaps a slight projection as well in this kind of worldview, because in some sense there is this inclination that, well, I want to make my living how I want to make my living, and the rationale is essentially that's how I wanted to do it. But it seems unfair to say, well, this is how I wanted to do it, and at the same time it costs the collective such an institution as private property. That it's all hinged on being able um, to demand both license for yet more freedom, but at the same time a collateral sympathy in concordance with that freedom that is demanded. I would say that you can only demand for one. You can demand for sympathy or for liberty, but not both packaged together. Otherwise, there is a kind of unaccountable and unchecked hypocrisy that is disguised, uh, or that sort of gets baked into the mix. There was a better way of expounding this. I haven't quite navigated that route. All of these themes, I think, are better centered if I go into the broader sort of tangent here, which is a bigger sort of issue. Like, the reason why I want sex work legalized, um, and this came up with other aspects of the conversation. I hope I'm pronouncing this right, or I've got the term correct. Um, I don't have my notes with me. Nash equilibrium. So the whole aspect of Nash equilibrium came up because I kind of spoke about uh, because biologically men and women are different, um, in special regard to sexual uh, um, women have eggs and men have um, spermazoa or whatever that is relatively plentiful, and eggs are relatively scarce. And women, they carry the child um, physically for 9 months and are vulnerable when they do so and need, let's say, security or whatever. So these biological differences between men and women mean that there is an entirely different opportunistic sexual strategy between the sexes. That the male opportunistic sexual strategy and the female opportunistic sexual strategy are characteristically distinct, and sexual culture and sexual norms and things like that, and sexual behavior uh, has this tension built into it. And I don't want to lay all this out laboriously, but we can understand that essentially marriage was something of a settlement um, that has a kind of mutually assured destruction with regard to the opportunistic sexual strategy. Um, Now, there is something broader than this in some sense, because I think that when I say that, I mean it and I don't mean it, in that I think that the only way to actually have an authentic interrelatedness between the sexes is if there is a cultural awareness of the Nash equilibrium, in the idea that, for example, something like marriage is the mutually assured destruction. But in some sense, the reason why I want this to be known is so that this does not actually become the explicit conscious rationale. In some sense, I think the Nash equilibrium must be pervasively understood so that it can be pervasively, I don't know how to describe this, like a negative normativity, in that everything that occurs is an avoidance of this. Every um, the best example I have is the Russian aristocracy, essentially, which that is one way of doing it, essentially, which is I hate repeating this story all the time, but so they had a deep philosophy about understanding intrigue, and intrigue is because intrigue is the precursor of seduction, and seduction is the precursor of lust, and lust is a more general term here, but essentially it ends up also meaning that you do not marry for convenience because it's undignified, and the love is fallacious, and you also cannot marry someone when a third person, let's say the average reasonable bystander, would believe that it was a marriage for convenience, because then even such a tainted context, an overshadowing, would create tensions within the union, because it would create it would create this intrigue of expectation or something like that. I mean, I haven't recounted all their philosophy exactly, and I do think that in some sense it is slightly a bit too formalistic and maybe lacks some requisite essentialism and sort of finding a way to ground itself without having to rely on, let's say, external facts. But I think that there is something to managing things on that level. Uh, to create the right cultural context in which authenticity can blossom uh, in relations that are undergirded by, let's say, real physical and biological uh, constraints. Uh, and essentially, those constraints need to be transcended. And I do think that essentially part of the recipe of consciously transcending them is that the Nash equilibrium becomes apparent so that it can be consciously um, negated, as it were, as the conduit of facilitating the meeting place. So essentially, that the meeting place does not get tainted by the Nash equilibrium. I'm still not articulating this perfectly, but I think thematically perhaps I've expressed it. Um, Now let me continue to say that the actual problem in today in gender politics or sexual politics is that women are too costly. And I mean this very technically. I mean this in terms of the opportunistic female sexual strategy is too cheap for them to get away with. We need women to burden the cost of their own opportunistic sexual strategy, because right now it it's too costly for men, and it's too cheap for women not to um, try to exploit men through it, and it has a kind of and anyway. So maybe you can kind of pick up. Let me explain why the female opportunistic sexual strategy is too easy for a woman to get away with, and that it's unbalanced from the male side of the equation. Uh, it's for a number of reasons, and many of these reasons can be um, changed. But I don't know if I would. I definitely wouldn't change one of them. And so some of them could anyway. Abortion might as well be mentioned. But essentially, if a woman gets pregnant, that's no longer a deterrent for not having an authentic relationship with someone that is capable of having the long haul, because abortion is available. So essentially, the availability of abortion means that a woman does not have to know beforehand, before sex, if the person that they're having sex with is worthy of having a long term relationship with. That can be ascertained after the sex, essentially, um, because of the availability of abortion. Um, that means that there's less ne- of a suppressing or negative deterrent against vetting men. So women therefore no longer have to vet men up front. So that means that they don't have to look for, can I trust this person? They don't have to. This is the general theme between all of them, is that women gauging if they can trust a man or not is no longer very important. It has been de-emphasized by all of these things that I'm talking about, that I will go through. The next one is child support. Um, it used to matter if children were legitimate or illegitimate, and one of the reasons why it mattered was because, uh, well, intestate rights of inheritance, but also essentially the de facto ease of being able to extract child support. Legitimacy played a role. It no longer plays a role. Essentially, a woman does not have to worry if the man is honorable or not, and if he will take care of his offspring, because a judge will compel a man to do that. Again, it means vetting a man becomes de-emphasized from the woman's side. And this also creates these two things, abortion and child support, creates between them a negative synergy and somewhat of a trap, essentially, that a woman after being pregnant can kind of meditate on, even after not knowing anything about this man, can then ascertain how much money does he have or is he likely to have in the future in his bank account, because essentially what is the ability to pay child support, essentially. And that's, anyway, that's wholly undesirable, but that is a dynamic which is created. Um, I'm not saying, oh, well, the man, it takes two to tango. The man has made himself susceptible to this. I agree. But in some sense, the state of the culture and the relations between the sexes, there used to be in some sense, there was actually a natural balance between the male and female sexual opportunistic strategy. And within that balance, there was a meeting grounds in which authenticity could be negotiated, and people actually had to judge the character of their partner, and vet their partner, and maybe match up values, and work out if they're capable of negotiating values, and such. Anyway, what are the other things? Yes, I mean, maybe, I don't know. That's kind of all the big ones, and then I guess the last one would just sort of be general feminist ideology or something like that, which empowers women and gives women this kind of cultural hegemon. Well, I would ironically say that it infantilizes women within a narrative, that then they become codependent on that narrative and forcing compliance with that narrative. Now, in some sense, I think decriminalizing sex work is a pressure release valve, and even destigmatizing sex work and normalizing it would allow. Sorry, I was slightly interrupted. So I guess anyway, my last point is just really that there is a let's say an anti-Nash equilibrium cultural um, uh, treatise, which is let's say adding fuel to the fire of the, because in some sense it doesn't matter what the state of the law is, if it's not readily applicable, as it were, or it doesn't matter if abortions are available if people don't feel that it's uh, if it's the right thing to do, or if it's something that they feel comfortable doing, or something like that. So the destigmatization of these things, and the let's say the celebration of these things, as being empowering and sort of being enlightened or something like that, creates a kind of propaganda and rhetoric which essentially, I would say, sort of puts the female opportunistic sexual strategy on a kind of hyper ready propensity towards being applicable in some sense. And I see the biggest loser in this recipe is essentially authenticity between relations or interrelations between the sexes. Um, Okay, so I could, yeah, there's probably a better formulation of that, but that's roughly what's going on. So this is why I think, in some sense, the legalization of, because I'm happy to be on the side of the libertarian expansion of power, and I think that if we can not add sympathy on that, that then what has to take now there are problems in some sense because there are societies in which it really would be a bad idea to legalize sex work, and my country might be one of them, just because of the general state of poverty. For practical reasons, I mean, this is going to be so rude for some people to hear, but essentially, my country is one of the few countries that I would say legitimately has a problem with rape. Um, because I think that essentially the rape culture in other Western countries is just uh, it's it's just more of the sort of the feminist ideology of, in some sense, trying. I mean, it's ironic because it does kind of lead. This is such a toxic topic to talk about, and it's it is ugly, but women with their sort of ideological tunnel vision are literally dramatizing within their narrative in such a way so as to engineer the expression of the kinds of thing that they complain about. I mean, I'm blaming the victim here, I guess, is sort of what I'm talking about. But in some sense, that's my general sort of theme here, is that you can't just excuse yourself and say, well, this is how I wanted it to be, this is how I wanted it to go, this was my unilateral vision of how me playing this role was meant to be received and corresponded with by every other node in society. And in some sense, it is to willfully close one's eyes um, in order to somehow gain the moral high ground, in order to make more um, demands against the collective to comply with your wishes. Um, and in some sense, this is somewhat the problem: is that you expect government to enforce a level of preschool-esque, um, let's say, convenience and comfort that people are supposed to render to one another, without going through the valid route to supposedly achieve this, which is by actually perver- uh, persuading and convincing and confronting the human condition. In some sense, uh, in my earlier example, expecting society to absorb the fact that some people have parents that would be coercive to their own children. This is something that government, I think, fundamentally is not equipped to prevent. It is equipped to react to it, perhaps, but it's not equipped to prevent it. And preventing the opportunity for people to express responsibility, but also then, therefore, as a correlating permutation of this, is also to um, express the lack of or missing accountability, or failed a failure in responsibility, which in some sense is what capitalism and private property allows us to actually see, that without private property, responsibility and people's ability to um, manage responsibility, or to actualize it, or the lack thereof, would be deprived, that everyone would be made harmless in the shadow of, some kind of nanny government. And in some sense, we have just deprived ourselves of the ability to see the level at which our common humanity, or the people that we inhabit, that we cohabit um, within our society, we lose the ability to visibly track where they are at, um, under the yoke of this sort of infantilism of what I've already described as essentially what becomes a totalitarianism, which in this kind of instance is supposedly being arrived at because essentially it's promoting libertarianism combined with sympathy. Uh, that essentially it first asks for the libertarian license, uh, and then it sends the bill for perpetual sympathy, to correlate with it. Uh, there was a broader thing that I wanted to say about private property, but so I mean, this is the general problem: is that there is a built-in assumption, or rather a generalization, a presumptuous generalization that private property amounts, or generally amounts, or roughly equates to theft. And and I really, it is ugly of me to use this ad hominem, as it were, but I just kind of mean it as a metaphor to try to create a low resolution sort of image of my argument. That and I don't think it particularly applies to this person in this case, who I think is quite intellectually sort of aware and able to explore these things. Um, so I'm projecting onto them, and I'm also sort of perhaps also putting words in their mouth, but in some sense it can just be taken as a standalone sort of motif that then, as a kind of just as a so I can create an encapsulated thesis that then can be looked at as a kind of almost as a piece of art, and less so as a particular argument against this person, but that the heart of a starving artist, uh, that needs to generalize that capitalism or private property is theft, because essentially they conducted their life in such a wise so as to say, well, that's how I wanted to do it. Is there not a lapse in responsibility there? Especially in the case that this heart of a starving artist is not prepared to starve for it. And essentially, the idea that the art created by such a person needs needs to be, let's say, collectively insured or underwritten by the structure at large, um, but can only pay so in the extraction of a sympathy that is billed to the government, is in some sense a formula for one person's optimal fairness at too high a price, um, in being able to essentially diffuse from an entire civilization the ability to make responsibility visible, or at least rather to make responsibility inconsequential. Now, I'll say as well about the gender politics that I do think in general, and I have to say this sort of with a pinch of salt or something like that, that in some sense I think the blame in the disequilibrium between the genders or between the sexes or uh, whatever lies on the female side. And I say this because, and I mean that as a generalization, which means that it cannot be levied against individual women. Um, Somewhat of an obtuse observation, but generally speaking, it is that I had this in my spiel and now I've kind of lost the thread of it. I don't want to say this in the way of, that women um, have acclimatized themselves to a level of exploitation um, of sexuality, which comes at a cost, which then they also want to complain about after burdening that cost. And perhaps there is something to the idea that if women were to maximally condition society in order to facilitate their opportunistic sexual strategy, that it does essentially tend towards, let's say, communism, or let's say, because they are used to being offered free drinks, and at some point they realize that it's much more stable if they could like socialize the free drinks so that they can get them at any stage of life and they don't ever have to use that window of peaked um, uh, yeah, I don't want to reduce it to that motif of essentially that there is an excess of attentiveness that women receive early in life, um, and that men have to earn and graduate to, in terms of a comparable sexual marketplace, sort of status and value. That women, in some sense, are biologically dispensed uh, this power in the sexual marketplace, and men have to earn it. And this is why, in some sense, men peak later And I mean, there's also sort of a reason for this, is that generally speaking, I mean, and this is why there are age gaps in the way that they are, between men and women. And if you can understand that age gap as essentially a transfer of effort between the sexes, that let's say when a man in his 30s or 40s has a partnership with a woman in her 20s, that there, and let's say they create a union, that there is a contribution of effort that is disproportionate, um, coming from the masculine side. And this is the, let's say, this is the general norm. I mean, I'm not saying that this is, I mean, this is not a law of nature. I mean, in some sense, some women can't do this because they have too much. It would be impossible for them to form a union with someone who had a disproportionate, anyway. So I mean, there are fringe cases to this. When people marry into royalty, um, or marry into celebrity, or marry into something. I mean, actually, in those sorts of cases, there's usually there's some other status that is being, amalgamated with. There's some other effort, and so in some sense, women are looking for contributions of effort, or they're looking for some kind of status or importance on some kind of metric. Um, some are perhaps more practical than others. Some are, um, and in some sense, I think it is weighted towards, on some level, that certain needs, certain pragmatic needs have to be. Anyway, this is a tangent, but you kind of get the point. That generally speaking, it is the. You see, I don't want to say that it's just the norm, but it's the expectation that is built into the structure between the relationship between the sexes. That's the kind of point that I wanted to get to. Is that there is this anticipation, and that anticipation is structured into how women read society, in terms of how they, because sexuality is a component of how we interface, and also how we conduct ourselves, and how, in some sense, we are generally orientated. I mean, sexuality, that's even a synonym for sexuality, is orientation. Um, so anyway, there are these layers and components to it. And anyway, so I'm just trying to say that there is an imbalance there, and it does have a biological component to it. Um, and this has filtered through into the culture, and it has come over in the side of empowering the female opportunistic sexual strategy, and it has destabilized, um, all of our systems, but especially normative morality, has crumbled under the weight of this sexual beast, as it were. Or what I mean to say is that this reframing of sexuality and creating an ideological sort of gatekeeping, um, and rather a filter, and that filter has slowly incentivized, let's say, systemic oppression as being a general condition, creating this, slump towards totalitarian, um, how do I put this, moral hostage taking, which all makes sense according to the proclivity of essentially the female opportunistic sexual strategy. The devouring mother, dare I say, it's an archetypal language, but that essentially what has also occurred here is this is an important piece of it, is that it does start by dehumanizing men and, let's say, the contribution of this effort in this, let's say, conventional exchange. Because, I mean, there's also good biological reasons for this. First of all, in terms of the health of children, the physical health of children, it is biologically optimal that women have children, let's say, not later than their mid-20s, roughly somewhere around there. Look, maybe within 2-3 years of that is kind of the biological optimum. And starting from the age of maybe the age of 19, but also starting maybe slightly later. I don't know everything about biology, but it's something like a window. For each woman, it's going to be somewhere within that window would actually be the optimum or something like that. And then you also have to factor in that, technically women should be having 2 children to at least replace the population or something like that. So that would generally be, let's say, kind of ordinary in terms of bog standard, ordinary in terms of just like biological replenishing, as it were, or something like that. Okay. Anyway, I'm just trying to make like a very rough sort of metric of this, but the that you understand that obviously when women are pregnant, they are vulnerable. They want they need to be provided for, and they need to be supported. So obviously they need a structure with conventions and a culture and a stable enough edifice that they can trust, and I think that this in some sense informs some of the ways in which women act, which is in some sense almost perhaps an adaptation for gauging reliability. I think that in some sense that could be done on a more sophisticated level, that there are ways of upscaling that kind of vigilance so that it doesn't have to be acted out in, let's say, more crude ways to accomplish the same level of ascertainability of that trait that is in some sense a biological optimum or something like that. Anyway, I'm just trying to say that there is at least a biological account for why there is this, let's say, ordinary expectation that there should be a transfer of effort from men to women, and essentially at some point society contains the things that it contains because someone has worked to provide it. And when women engage in this kind of union, as it were, in order to gain access to being provided for in relation to a provider, and the idea that they can now be their own providers, and obviously they would still have their own sexual proclivities that they would have to harmonize and attune, or at least reckon with, or resolve into some kind of stable form in which they want to live their version of the good life. What am I saying? So anyway, I'm just, I guess I'm now I'm sort of just painting sort of vague sort of cases, but I mean, in some sense, I would say even in the traditional arrangements, women were often their own providers. I mean, in some sense, men were failures, and what often happened is the father of the wife uh, would provide support. Um, or, I mean, sort of, I mean, there's often been money also in the female line kept independent because of essentially legacy and inheritance. At least in the West, um, there has been somewhat of a tradition of independent female um, money, as long as there was sort of some man in the system legally up to a certain time. But essentially, um, anyway, this is a sort of complicated question, and this really, in some sense, generally only applies to the aristocracy, or at least the upper classes, or at least uh, the very wealthy, perhaps, or at least the semi-wealthy. But anyway, but in other senses, women were also could have been understood to be even the sole or the primary or the or quite substantial providers. So anyway, I'm not. But at least symbolically, if for nothing more than the reasons of sexuality itself, the symbolism of man of a man or a husband providing uh, stability and protection um, is a category that lives in anyway. I mean, so I mean, why am I even talking about this? So, I mean, I don't think sexuality has to be rationalized. I don't think it has to even be grounded in reality. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, in some sense, I think that you can all sort of just transition it into role play, as it were, in even quite a imaginative, cerebral sort of fashion, in the sense that you don't need to dress up for this kind of role play. You can just kind of wear it on the inside, in terms of just kind of creating a play scene in your head, and that contributes a different kind of energy or something like that to the experience, and it's being explored in a kind of co-creative sort of fashion. Um, it's a bit weird talking about sex essentially, or in a kind of in a psychologically somewhat surreal way, but to me, these things, I think, can be exercised to the point of that they're going to be a theme of communication that themselves are not going to, I think, in a healthy relationship, ever fester into a rut of stagnation of particular themes, perhaps, or uh, certain themes will be revisited if certain historic tensions or confluence of so I mean I guess I'm talking about sex as almost like a form of healing in the process of life, or regeneration. Um, anyway, uh, this is perhaps too much of a bit of a spiritual sort of overlay, but in this sense, I think that consciousness of anything doesn't mean that it has to be manifested. Um, that the symbolism can be explored without it being true and it can be experienced and let's say naturally or organically exhausted, and then something new can be explored later on. It's not that change or having a sedentary position on these matters is either of them ideal. It's a co-creation thing. But anyway, I'm just trying to say that there's an avenue in which everything is negotiated anyway, but there is something to be said about having the same map of conditions upon which themes can be treated properly, so as which is to say, not to infect one's belief structure with certain residues that build up and that garner charge and resentment or expectations that have not been negotiated. Anyway, I mean, the only thing I can do at this point is just point at metaphors and things like that, which are not really useful, but essentially a healthy relationship would be like a circulatory system. Uh, anyway, I'll just leave that at that sort of vague point. But okay, so what have I said now? So I've said all of that. So in some sense, I don't care who the provider is, because to me, sexuality is going to be independent of that anyway. But in some sense, I think a lot of people, it won't yet be independent for them because they're not fully conscious and integrated, perhaps, or something like that. But I mean, this is getting so sophisticated. But it would be nice if the Nash equilibrium was at least in everyone's face, so that there was more of an obvious meeting place in terms of negotiation. So, I mean, it was raised the concept of sexual anarchism and essentially bespoke negotiations. And I mean, I think that those are wonderful sounding terms. And essentially, I think that I've somewhat explored how anarchistic sexuality navigates perhaps and overcomes and surmounts the kind of performative role sort of expectation around what is probably premised and grounded in some kind of biological inclination, which has also probably been imprinted into, I guess, social constructs and norms and things like that. I don't really see a real meaningful purpose in distinguishing between biology and culture and social constructs. I think that it really doesn't matter. The one will reflect the other to some degree, and if we consciously change the culture, eventually the biology will acclimatize, and in some sense, because in some sense, the mediating thing that is moving to do any of that is the discerning, is the understanding, is the consciousness component of it, which in some sense I think is distinct from both culture and from the biology. And just because we are riddled with language which comes from our culture doesn't mean that our understanding is endemically given over to it. But this is something that we did sort of touch on earlier, and I'm not going to touch on that topic to clean it up, but I'll just take that as read for this recording. But yeah, so in some sense, I kind of went off the rails. I didn't quite keep to my topic when I was talking about women being the as a gender being the side that is really containing the imbalance and the problem in terms of the gender politics. And I think men are overly desperate in these current times because they are is sexually deprived is probably a component of it, but that sexual deprivation that I'm talking about is on a wider scale because it involves the dehumanization of, let's say, the healthy masculine role, which has meant, quite ironically, I mean, it's weird how much masculinity is labeled as toxicity, and in all that noise, somehow toxic masculinity gets robustly emphasized and enhanced. It's very strange, um, and there are forms of masculinity uh, which are lost in the noise of the screeching of the moral panic around toxic masculinity, which essentially just kind of goes. Oh, it gets ignored to trying to the kind of the idiosyncratic masculine particularity is sidelined to such an extent that hmm, when I'm trying to make this point, I'm not. I haven't thought about it enough. I'm not thinking about myself, but I almost want to say that like intellectualism used to be sexy, and in some sense there is still a contingent of people who are sapiosexual, but even that well has been poisoned by the current cultural crisis. it has been made. I don't know if I it's too much to say perhaps that it's been made. It's because the status of intellectuals that don't bend the knee to the cultural hegemon is tinged with danger, and that danger, I think, has poisoned the well, as I say. Um, and so a myriad of masculine, idiosyncratic sexual prowess is dampened in the face of this totalitarian surge, or of cultural totalitarianism. Um, okay, I mean, I haven't made this point too neatly, but I guess it's another sort of fragment. I think that point could be developed a bit better. But it is something also to be said about the I hate this. This will just sound like slander, but there is this thing within women, I think, to kind of conform to some kind of lowest common denominator, because as a block, women can control social constructs and culture to a very high degree, but only by acting as a block and by mediating some kind of standard and conformity and convention, because then that convention can be used to cajole. I don't mean this in a negative sense, but to civilize men as well, to force them to conventionalize their which will also create sort of patterns of potential congregation and allow things to, I mean, it's weird, help meet. It will help things to generally anyway. Okay, I mean, that's a bit of a yeah, but maybe you can get the theme from that. I'm not going to go that much further, but what I'm saying is that this tendency that women have, in some sense, is almost a bit of a heuristic. Um, that it allows society to usually create a game, and in some sense, this makes society very palpable and consumable for children to acclimatize and to grow within society. So, in some sense, I would even say it's a heuristic that is necessary in order to create low level narrative models that allow children to graduate from stable layers of inculcated anyway. So, as far as I can see, women have this tendency, and it's it's also valuable and useful for them themselves, not just their children, because it allows them to. I'm not going to substantiate this properly, as this is so this isn't going to be set forth like a proper thesis. So you're just going to have to kind of go with the flow, as it were. But because I'm too tired to kind of lay this out substantively, but essentially, I think that this lends it. Essentially, it's part of hypergamy. It's part of also another component of the female opportunistic sexual strategy, which essentially is that you can kind of create a mechanism, a formula, and this is toxic to women themselves. Usually, they graduate out of it themselves when they kind of find some kind of harmonious balance of this. But it's like the idea that w- it's for you have to have some kind of systemic model of society or systemic view of possibilities within accessing different places within society, because I said that a bit too vaguely to make this point, but imagine that to be a bit better, that so that women are able to calculate opportunity cost. And in some sense, the idea opportunity cost, in some sense, can be directly extrapolated from hypergamy. And in some sense, that whole notion and concept, I would say, is ontologically grounded in the female contribution to culture. Okay, that's a bit of a. I mean that more thematically, I guess, than a hard claim. But anyway, um, just to kind of get this model off the ground. But so, and this is the problem: is that when you measure opportunity cost, um, I'm actually, that's the wrong word, but essentially opportunity cost in some sense becomes the existential headache. Oh, so I mean that's not even what I meant, I guess, but that eventually makes hypergamy toxic to the individual who's trying to perpetrate it, or for the woman who's trying to perpetrate hypergamy. Eventually, opportunity cost becomes a toxic concern because it becomes a stand-in for the actual thing that you have to gain by calculating the optimum way to outlay effort in order to optimize the opportunity cost. So like opportunity cost optimization essentially becomes a detached way of anyway, why am I saying this? So the reason why I wanted to bring this up is that this drive to deconstruct society in these terms so as to know how to position oneself in order to promote the, the, the highest number of high quality bidders to outbid each other so that I can, as a woman's, I'm talking hypothetically in this thought experiment, so that I can select the highest bidder and adjudicate between them who the highest bidder is likely to be, um, becomes a, again, like, well, essentially is a Nash equilibrium in itself. And I think it's very enlightening for men to know this about women, because then essentially then they might actively opt out of wanting to be Nash equilibriumed by a woman's hypergamy. Um, and then we're in the no man's land that I want us to arrive at. And in some sense, I think that another, the problem is that women have all this going on, and men have no counteractive weaponry against a judge compelling child support, or the woman choosing that, well, uh, it's so ugly and crude to say this, but essentially that, oh, he doesn't have enough money, so I can just get an abortion. And I didn't even know if he had enough money or not, because it looked like that he had a nice suit and it looked like that he had expensive cologne. Um, but then I found out 2 weeks later that the car was a lease, um, and that he didn't own that car, and it was a company lease or something like that. And then I saw what his salary actually is, or something like that. I mean, and then I saw his credit card bills, or something like that, and then I got an abortion. So you see what I'm depicting here. Um, it's almost like a dysutopia uh, of putting vetting trust up front, in a culture that is essentially supplementing responsibility for structures like judicial enforcement and, let's say, feminist centric uh, um, catering, which further de incentivizes the development of trusting relationships. And I guess you could say, well, maybe it's just men that need to vet women then. And it's men that have to kind of check if women are, on the level or on the square, or whatever metaphor, that they are red pilled women or something like that, or that they intellectually understand that, and in some sense, or they call this looking for a unicorn. Um, and in some sense, I think in some sense the numbers will make that impossible, because if there's no alternative in terms of the sexual deprivation, too many men will play along with it, or will get sucked into it, or will, essentially, they'll be perversely incentivized to kind of be absorbed by that cultural, um, essentially, when sexuality is at stake, the devouring mother essentially just has too many cards to play against, a juvenile's sexual tendencies and proclivities. Um, and in some sense, and this is why I say I'm hypocritical when I want to legalize sex work, because I just want to level the playing field, a bit on that dimension, so that uh, the cost to women themselves of hypergamy, so that they can get crowded out of the market, um, to some extent. Yeah. The analogy and the metaphor is a bit confusing and weak, because I say that essentially right now women are able to defer the cost of their own opportunistic sexual strategy directly onto men, and men have no defense against it, and men have generally speaking, no alternative. So I'm just trying to give them an alternative. So in some sense, that cost of that female sexual strategy gets redirected back on them, because essentially, uh, men can go another way. And that's why I say that I would even like to remove a lot of the stigma around sex work and to legalize it. But that is um, is a means to an end. Um, and the only way I can justify it is because I believe in responsibility, and I believe in libertarianism. And I think organically, then I get this byproduct of reaching a consensus on the Nash equilibrium, so that everyone can equally avoid it. Because essentially, a woman then when I say hooking up, when a woman is choosing to be with a man authentically, she knows that he could find a sex worker if she doesn't provide more value or authenticity. That because right now, from the female perspective, men have uh, women have access to a cornered market. Anyway, if you follow all of that, oh my word, so much, all over the place. But that's basically. So I guess I'll add this to my view on the ideal. But yeah, in my country, with the level of poverty that we have, in some sense, I don't want to add this piece. I guess I'll have to do it. You see, I mean, there's the reason why, for example, it's still sex work is still illegal in my country. Is in some sense very similar to the reason why statutory rape is illegal. And it's interesting. I saw randomly in a different forum a debate between people who said, when someone is convicted of statutory rape, shouldn't the underage party also receive a penalty if they, let's say, were a willing participant or perhaps initiated it, or something like that? If they were the person who kind of instigated the relationship and the sexual conduct, shouldn't the instigating party also receive some penalty because the other person gets thrown in jail for the statutory rape? Now, the reason why this is such a bad idea to have a penalty for the underage participant or involved is because the whole point of statutory rape is to protect the underage person. And if you added any kind of components of penalization to the underage person, then you would actually have incredibly perverse and toxic byproducts, because essentially you would make them susceptible to blackmail. Essentially, underage people who are, let's say, naturally, they haven't reached the age of majority, they could be duped. They could be extorted. They could be told stories, and essentially that could make them vulnerable to abuse and coercion. Because an adult could tell them all these things that essentially that they would tell the judge that they were seduced by the other person. And this is why it must be said explicitly, and it must be well known and broadcast, that it doesn't even matter if the younger person was the instigating party, that they will definitely receive no liability and no charge, and no that the law will not hold them responsible. They will only hold the adult responsible. That is the only way that statutory rape functions, and that's why, as a deterrent and also as a credible, why it even exists, essentially, in the utility of protecting the interests and the rights of children, or underaged persons. Anyway, now in the same way, and that's, you could call that a trade-off, and it is a trade-off, and everything is a trade-off. So, in the same wise, you have the issue of sex work. Essentially, the problem with sex work is that you can imagine a scenario in which if you made it more permissible or legal, that at some point someone who is financially dependent on somebody else could coerce that person to entering into the sex trade or sex work. And essentially then it would start becoming very difficult to detect cases of rape. that essentially the boundary of rape and let's say economic compulsion starts to become a very undesirable gray area. And then you have layers of kind of collateral, you know, and again, and also the issue of essentially stigma as well, that essentially that a lot of that stigma is in some sense a defense of the libertarian scope of responsibility and the visibility of responsibility, to not be swallowed up in in conflations. Or rather convoluting issues, where essentially, eventually, society becomes the collective insurer of against parents, against morally deficient parents that don't take appropriate care in being responsible for those who are dependent on them, or who are their ward, or who are anyway. Now I've kind of, in a circular way, I've gone back to an old argument, but let me think if there's any. Yeah, so sadly, it's that grey area. I should make. I should have made a more intelligent point about the grey area, but what I was trying to say is that grey area. I wrote something before I made this recording. Let me just read it. All the grammar of it is not perfect, but so the grey area, I think, is also the nexus of the stigma. That stigma is the only thing standing between society and coercive parents from taking society morally hostage in order to provide the end of capitalism, delivered essentially to the moral plight of sex workers. And essentially this is problematic for me, is because I don't want capitalism to end. Because I don't want government to be fair to people, I want people to learn and choose to be fair enough to each other, and to work out how to affect that balance, or to mediate whatever that is. I think that is the role of culture in some sense, as well. Not culture as an institution, but culture as an environment for individuals to signal through culture and to reform culture, or to update it, or to take the responsibility of handling it, so that it reflects the solution to these kinds of issues. So let's say a conscious management of one's culture, not culture as a collective enterprise of some kind of collective intelligence. And I'm not going to go into the tangent debunking collective intelligence, but essentially this was also part of the discussion. The thing that is poisonous about collective intelligence, and even talking about, let's say, objectively standardizing or rating intelligence, is that it's an adjective that is appended onto someone's discerning, and you only get the discerning that you have, and the only thing that can judge discerning is discernment, and that discernment is also open to being updated by your discernment. So it's not immutable, except to say that that was my discernment and that now it isn't anymore, and that would have to be made in the actual and not in the hypothetical, as a way to derail the qualifying adjective that one would place on things. So to try to create a stable adjective about something being intelligent or not is really a kind of it's fundamentally it's an endorsement that should be substantiated in terms of the content of a discerning, rather than an immutable quality about the discerning, which is why essentially rating qualities of discernment is itself an antithetical, self-refuting proposition, uh, which is what I would call forbidden. And you can do it as a means to, as part of a means that has a reprocessing element to it, which then has an independent substantiation that has to be made from discerning itself in some sense, in which case this element in the mix essentially becomes, let's say, an inspiration, which is just a kind of concurrent um, initiating impetus, which is just a context, or it's like an ontological descriptor, but it doesn't have any independent value other than just being part of the narrative or the story. But it's actually beside the point in terms of the independent substantiation that discernment would have to render to back it up. Sorry, this is getting a bit dry and technical, and I'm probably too tired to delve into these issues more broadly. But essentially, I think that's, yeah, I need to stop this recording and go to bed. And right now, I'm just sort of rehashing some of the highlights in my mind of how discussions went. This is an awkward addendum that I'm just going to sort of tack on as a standalone sort of thing, and it does thematically, I think, link up to some of the things that I was talking about in terms of totalitarian culture, but it's much more subtle, and it's much more personal, and I feel like this is going to sound ugly and something like that, and perhaps it's a bit of a peculiar argument from me, because I don't know many other people that would make this kind of argument, so it is peculiar to me. It's not a general philosophy. Well, I mean, I structure all of my reasoning in general metaphysics, so, but not many people share my metaphysics, but I do think that my metaphysics should be shared by many people, so I am proselytizing when I do this, but I don't mean to make ugly smears against people, especially when I hope to win them over with my version and my understanding and my treatment of the topic. So I would be interested to know what the answer was, or what the comment is on my treatment on this issue. So let me name the issue. Uh, the issue is my disdain for they them pronouns. The reason why I disdain they them is because they are gender neutral. I don't mind following the gender pronoun that I'm directed towards using, the gendered pronoun, but I do disdain the neutral pronoun. Also because it's it's grammatically also not quite the same. It doesn't have quite the same fidelity because it it collectivizes they and them, but that's actually not my issue. My issue is actually the neutrality of it. This is because me as a particular person, I see everyone as a mix of gender, and I cannot stop myself from doing that, and I will not stop myself from doing that even if I do modulate my use of language. And so for me, it's a mismatch between my own belief and my own image, and is in my image that is contended in the definitional makeup of how I conceive of my experience of others, and my discerning of others, as it were. And that will always be independent of other people's preferences, and I cannot bend it. And let me just say that the reason why this issue comes up for me is because I used the gender neutral pronoun they, them in this recording, and I did that because I wanted to keep the source of what I was talking about anonymous. I did not want, because I was trying to generalize it as well, but also I did not want it to be seen that I was particularly directing this at that person. Slightly paradoxical in this particular scenario, which I won't explain, but someone might be able to decode it from that. I did that, and that's what, for the very reason that I just said. That's why I felt weird doing it as I was doing it, because in some sense, in reference to that person, they might think that actually I was being particularly driven at them when I was actually trying to make my words ambiguous and broad. They might think that I was particularly averring all of my statements directed particularly at them, when I was actually trying to explicitly make all my thinking in my treatise a kind of obtuse treatment on the issue at large. Anyway, man, I'm not going to treat this issue with enough finesse, sadly, because I'm going to use a very crude metaphor to make my point. In the Harry Potter books, who was that they had to treat anonymously? Who was that which they could not name and refer to? It was Voldemort that people, in their fear and 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 lack of courage, would refer to him in the anonymous uh, inference. Um, so it was harder to examine the character of Voldemort and to discern his contents, and to, let's say, humanize or naturalize, or to invigilate, that it makes one a special, unique category to rely on that kind of systemic fear, that when others might speak of you, because generally pronouns do not function in the direct. You never use someone's pronouns when you are talking to them. You only use someone's pronouns when you're talking about them. And it is true that you can talk about someone to them in a I can't grammatically describe it nicely, but essentially, there are reasons why you would do that, and generally, usually it's when you're talking about some level of abstraction or some level of usually actually it's also when you're perhaps talking about normative morality, because and you want to use them as an example. But essentially, having to use a so-called gender-neutral pronoun, which also, that pronoun is also in the plural, so it's also a generalization in some sense, because when you say they, them, not only is it not particular as is not in the I wish I had the terminology offhand, but it's at least not in the case in which that it's a particular case, it's a general case. Which in some sense does also confer a level of anonymity which is grammatically present, almost as if their essence is beyond invigilation, or at least inspection. And in some sense, it's also a general bar against somebody else discerning things about your character. I think it is an insulating defense mechanism in that way. Now, bear with me as I apologize for why I fully endorse gendered pronouns and not gender neutral pronouns. So the reason why I endorse gendered pronouns is because and believe me, I've had it's not as if that this is clear and simple and easy, because there are hermaphrodites to which that this is problematic. Albeit fringe cases, they are real people. And the hermaphrodites that I have known, after much philosophizing and getting to grips with these sorts of things, this might sound strange to some people, but I've been able essentially to usually broker, I think, I mean, I can't speak for every hermaphrodite, but essentially, I have believed that it is the yeah, there are there are particular levels of complexity to this which might be hard for the current listener to understand this, but this is, let's say, within a very high functioning culture. This is within the context of a church, in which a very different kind of functioning church to other churches, in which titles mean something and words mean something. And titles are used interchangeably all the time, that a husband will speak to his wife using different titles to denote a different context, that he will say priestess and then say something, and then he will say sister, and then he will say something, and it's part of the grammar at the level at which that it is received. And so there is already some flexibility to the understanding that brother and sister are 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 of commensurate um, value, uh, and and in any way, it is not so much the brother and the sister is a much wider ambit, because uh, it contains all the other roles combined within it. It's, let's say, the most basic, but it also is the broadest base, as it were. And so I guess I'll just say that I use both brother and sister. Uh, not I wouldn't say brother and sister. I mean, I would either use brother or I would use sister, depending on not in alternation, not in you know n- not in a fickle way. Um, anyway, uh, but in any case, I think uh, this is a fringe case. Let me talk about it generally, and then perhaps that would give insight into how I'm actually conducting myself in that fringe case, which is that the reason why I insist on gendered pronouns, and I'll be directed to use any one of them, uh, any one of the two, is because I believe people are an admixture of both, and I will not be stopped in judging that admixture for myself. And it doesn't matter to me which one I use, so much as I have a base upon which to layer my judgment of the admixture. So as long as the convention is set, uh, then I can use that as the so the idea that I'm going to update this reference, that I'm going to update this convention constantly, and that they're going to update me on how the convention changes. Uh, this is an imposition on my internal um, discerning, uh, and it's an annoyance. So, I would not do it in a fluid way, but I would do it in a way in which, if it was properly considered, and if in some sense there was some um, uh, confusion, uh, I mean, essentially, you can see from my worldview, I guess, that I consider this kind of confusion to be um, really quite superficial, because in some sense you are more concerned. to control how other people think about you than you are to actually exude yourself, as it were. Um, and in some sense, you need the thoughts of others in order to contextualize and to coalesce a sense of self. And I understand that people can feel, let's say, intimidated by a hostile uh, atmosphere of non-validation and non-compliance to one's own preferences, or something like that. But at some point, that is a circumstance that must be managed. And in some sense, I am sensitive to the plight and sympathetic to the plight of some who, let's just say, live such an unconventional and rare experience, so that they are a minority experience, that they do not find ample room in the culture to be readily received and anticipated, that there is an economy of attention that does not accommodate their special or unique um, dispensation as they compare the lot of others, and what seems to be dispensed to other identities um, that is not received by theirs. But that sort of reduction, or that sort of model, I'm afraid, does not surmount the trouble of the economy of attention. The problem of the economy of attention is a real problem, and it cannot be surmounted by extracting sympathy or demanding sympathy or enforcing sympathy. That is an abrogation of libertarian agency, of self-determinism, uh, of responsibly making room for yourself if you can. And if you do not find the allyship in order to accommodate you, then perhaps you must regard that you have chosen or wanted to live your life in such a way so as not to meet with the thinking that is structured in the models of attention um, and the streams of attention uh, as they so liberally and freely conduct themselves in the flows and in the structures that inhabit the environment in which you cohabit and share. But the idea that you're going to ask for an equal and fair piece of the territory, in that all identities must be regarded equally, this is not a reasonable or even possible synthesis uh, of a moral settlement. Um, because the number of special cases that one can envision is literally infinite. And I can understand what you're saying is that, yes, there are lots of extreme things, but all perhaps you are being asked to do is to change the grammar to accept gender neutrality as a fixed category and to essentially alter the language. Um, I mean, some people want a lot more of language alteration, and I'm not even willing to bend to that somewhat uh, trifling um, adaptation. I do use gender neutral pronouns for the purpose of bequeathing anonymity. That's uh, what the grammar of gender neutral pronouns. That's what the grammar of gender neutral pronouns entails to me, and for me to expand the grammar to believe that there is someone who is gender neutral, if I come across it, if I come across such a perfect equilibrium and balance, perhaps I will. This is the thing: is that I don't think it even is conceptually possible for gender neutrality. In some sense, you could say that, oh well, it's evenly weighted, but even that will have a distinct quality of which component. It might be equally strong both ways, or something like that. But it would still be a distinct mix. It would essentially still be an admixture. Um, and to tell you the truth, I still haven't. I mean, I guess now I could be called bigoted or prejudiced, but I have a spiritual understanding of this, that everyone in their mind, in the first person in their mind, I believe that they are a he. And I believe that the soul is a her, the container. So themselves is a her, and he is a him. Um, oh, that. Sorry, I should rather say that there is themselves and there is himself. And in some sense, I think that the herself or himself, either one, is essentially within my gender, let's say, spiritual analysis or whatever. There's no such thing as herself. It's actually himself. Um, that the self-reference is always like. I mean, this is a sort of a connotation in some sense. Okay, I guess this is going to sound. I mean, this probably sounds putrid to some people, but anyway. So what's my point about saying this? Is that I think I messed that up slightly as well, because I think in some sense, I think her is also essentially like he. Oh wait, that's atrocious for me to say it like that. But essentially, her and him. Her and him are both the past tense of he. That's the best way of saying it, actually. That's what I mean, is that her and him are both the past tense of he. So this is maybe hard to follow, but this is in some sense, this is kind of oh my word, I'm so tired I can't even think of the word. Hermetic. Yeah, so I mean, this is sort of my hermetic alchemy talking. Um, and this is straight out of Genesis, but anyway, this is where I derive what I'm saying. Okay, so uh, her and him are both the past tense of he, and he is always in the image of God. Um, so when you invoke he, I mean, this is why you have to be careful about what you say about her and what you say about him, because what you say about her and what you say about him is a projection onto the image of God. Um, the character of her and the character of him, but in some sense, the character does not involve the spirit of man. It is always a valence of, essentially, or in essence, the spirit of God. So you could say that it has the representation of her and him might have big chunks missing out of it for a particular her or a particular him, but essentially your model of what you see there is the positive that you see, because there is essentially the negative is just essentially a lapse in the image. So it's an occlusion on let's say the image. Um, this is so esoteric. Anyway, uh, and he is the spirit. Okay, so like, so you know. So what did he do? He is always in the present tense. Uh, he is always the subject of the sentence, or she is the subject of the sentence. Um, so it always has an active property um, of doing something. Uh, the verb always belongs to uh, the present tense pronoun. Man, I've actually forgotten so much of my grammar terminology. It's a bit disgusting, but anyway. where am I going with this? So I'm talking off the top of my head, which is probably a bit dangerous. I mean, it would be interesting if you had a society that just used a single gender pronouns, um, not gender neutral, single gender. Um, I wonder. I think, in some sense, the somewhat of the pragmatic compromise would be to have a kind of ideological understanding of this. That on the outside, the language expression for female pronouns is different, but it's conceived of differently internally, as it were. Or it's because, I mean, in some sense, women are actually, I think, especially girls, they are able to pick up on social understandings and social conventions that they're actually prone to develop that kind of complexity. They're prone to absorb that kind of complexity, um, in terms of even linguistic complexity. Um, Women's ability to adopt uh, and mirror, sort of, and model meaning that is exhibited to them by the culture. I mean, you can see this as early as 3 years old. Um, Probably has something to do with the huge effect of testosterone on male brains. And you have to remember that very, very young males, infant males, have the same level of testosterone in their blood as boys going through puberty. And they have so much energy and drive, uh, fueled by testosterone, that they can, in some sense, only learn by their active motion, which then, through the direct consequentialism of their engagement, um, they see the effects um, of their actions and of their agency, and that is how they teach themselves, or they learn by their own hand, as it were, to put it metaphorically speaking. Whereas women are or girls are much more attuned to, even at a very young age, modeling interaction and learning the dynamics of receiving and sending. lessons and information, and teaching people by relationship. Um, Boys don't learn, uh, typically speaking, in that way. Although they can also, I mean, or at least primarily they don't, or at least not as their structures of learning are most impressionable as they are first developing. And in some sense, we all develop initially by our own actualization of engagement. Like the baby uh, learns about their own agency when they start to realize that the kicking that they're doing in their legs, and the perhaps the motion of something that is made contact with those legs, that they are the driver of the experiential novation and shift, which they are the cause thereof, that uh, then the mental impulse and the physical sensation is a cascade of the, anyway. So I mean, in some sense, that's relatively ungendered. So in some sense, I do think that there is a bit of a he in the intrinsic self-image, as it were. If you will allow me the gendering these two archetypes, as it were, of interfacing within, that we have gendered interfacing uh, with each other and with experience. And as I say, people are certainly an admixture of these interfacing tendencies. They wouldn't be able to function without both. They would be wholly stunted and incapable of development into any kind of sophistication or uh, uh, robust. They wouldn't be able to produce an understanding if they didn't have both, and sort of ways of accessing both styles of interface. Um, and I do think, in general, that people will bear the unavoidable mark of their biological development. That even if there was a girl who kept the conceptual agency as their core gendered drive, that they did that in the atmosphere or in the context of the lack of testosterone, or at least the lack of the typical level that a male is infused with testosterone. And so essentially, even their access of the male gendered interface style is itself I would say, usefully hinged and predicated within um, the convention, uh, that the base is female, and the admixture is a prominent robust admixture that's weighted towards the conscious development, let's just say, of the male interface. And certainly in terms of admixtures, there's a huge spectrum of gender, but without the conventional base, I think that we lose a layer of really contextualizing and understanding the scope of the admixture. Or we derange our ability to contact what's there. We anonymize and veil and disguise all these kinds of nuances, I think, when we demand from others a kind of enforced discerning, which I think is almost unavoidable in choosing for others words that have grammatical importation. Not that that is what happened in this case. I mean, I'm not saying I was directed. I'm just saying well, I guess take that as a general point, but something that I would have to probably caveat and to weaken in the context of this particular thing. But I guess take that as a general point on the subject. That's perhaps not particular in this particular, let's say, case or incident of anyway. Yeah, so I've kind of bumbled off into a strange sort of corner of giving my own sort of strange and peculiar reading of these sorts of issues, probably not in the most sort of coherent sort of sequence through these topics, but there's probably something in there that I've said that can kind of be wrapped up into a case for tolerance is a strange it's weird when only some people somehow only some people's plea for tolerance counts. Again, I don't mean to make these sort of stark things, and I've already sort of talked about cultural totalitarianism. There's probably a more sophisticated way for me to substantiate that, because now I'm just sort of name dropping these grave, dark things and saying, oh, I'm being persecuted or something like that. But there is something to a culture that cultivates this kind of narrative that ends up being, at the very least, entrenched in its own kind of lopsided bias, while professing sensitivity, but somehow sensitivity on metrics which are always not grounded in discerning itself, but grounded in some kind of superficial convention uh, that is taken to be a substitute to trump su- substantiated discerning, or particular substantiations or particular explanations. Something like that. Although, I mean, I've said this only saying my side of the story, and I haven't heard any feedback on this side of the story. So I would be interested to hear such feedback of how these views are uh, are taken. If they can be taken. Uh, with a tone of uh, hope in some kind of hashed out reconciliation, if there's a way that issues can issues about it can be worked out as towards some kind of synthesis, or some kind of revision, or some kind of but they also might just be way too kooky and peculiar uh, to expect perhaps even duplication or tolerance, but I also haven't done such a great job of setting them out. But I've perhaps given a sampling of the kind of level of uh, analysis that I operate from. Anyway. Ooh. As a means of going back and clearing up the point that I was making about Voldemort, that there's a theme in the Harry Potter books that the mystique of Voldemort is enhanced by people indulging in the opaqueness of the reference to them. And I've explained how, or I've suggested, although not explicitly, which I'm doing now, that that is linked essentially to the anonymizing of his reference. Um, and essentially, I've explained my resentfulness at having such anonymity um, in reference imposed by someone's even request, is a kind of imposed opaqueness that I find to be untoward. Um, that it is, in some sense, a way to impose mystique. And this kind of confirms with the general theme that gender dysphoria, and I do think that that is essentially the subject that is under review, in at least in my discourse, in my understanding of what's going on, is not about uh, the issue of gender within the self of such people making such requests. Uh, or to put a finer point on this, it's not about the issue of gender, or it is about the issue of gender within the self-image, and the distinction that I make between the self and the self-image is that they are trying to cultivate something in the self-image, or garner something from the self-image, not in how they relate to themselves, but in how um, uh, they wish that object for the self-image is to be delivered to them vicariously in how others consider their self-image and not how they consider themselves. And that is a kind of is essentially what I would say is the essence and what makes it a dysphoria. And perhaps there is jargon here uh, that helps to enforce this convoluting of the issues that essentially seek to align or equate the self with the self-image. Uh, Performative role is one of these things, I think. Uh, so perhaps it would behoove me to sort of pick that apart to some degree. I do think that there is something fishy about canonizing this conceptual category of performative role, which then puts people in a meeting place or in a meeting ground in which discernment and language have a one-to-one parallel. And again, I find this to be a sorry, I was just interrupted, so let me just locate myself in this again. That uh, the the conflation um, of performative role, I think, is a unjustified conduit in the imagination to believe that one is accessing the self-image via this, let's say, collective, emergent embodiment of the so-called performative role. And the idea that one is seeing oneself through the framework of the performative role is in some sense to view oneself from society's perspective. And I do take this to be a toxic and a poisonous framework that I think is only hypothetically accessed at the expense of the internal locus of control, the exercise of self-determinism, and it actually violates the relativism paradox, that as a category it is not accessible. It is of the same ilk of problem as essentially placing a qualifier on or an adjective onto discerning. Um, you can do so, but it's always going to be a kind of, let's say, an aesthetic, contextual sort of claim that is almost going to seek to maybe amplify or to I used sort of the idea of inspiration. It's sort of going to contextualize something as a sort of as an inspiration, but the idea that that inspiration could actually do something like fuel one's self-esteem, because it can have any kind of reach onto the self-image and therefore actually touch the self. There is a hard, impermeable division between the self-image and the self there, in which only discerning can speak for the self. And the idea that the performative role is going to have a bearing on that discerning is already a discerning that has given up the this is a sort of a greater sort of metaphysical claim, but essentially that they have systematized a substitution of discerning in order to supplement and to provide. Anyway, I have not set this up as rigorously as I should to make this point, but at least thematically, I think I've roughly sketched it. Um, that is not to say that performative roles don't exist as a category, but that you cannot actually garner knowledge of them. To do so is a form of forbidden knowledge. It is essentially an invalid form. It's like, and I have this similar thematic rejection of false religion, which comes in many different forms. I've kind of gotten into it in many different. It's the same theme that crops up. Game B. You cannot know anything about the knowledge of game B and hope to profit from it. It's going to be an inspiration, but it can never be an aspiration because it presupposes a method which usually has to be concurrent. Usually one only experiences inspiration at the same concurrent with a particular innovation. Um, and to kind of engage in aspiration or indulge in aspiration and treat it as inspiration, which is quite an ephemeral sort of thing, um, is to essentially try to extract a false form or a fundamentally hollow form of self-confidence, or let's say it's a form of toxic self-esteem which will never be reliable and will constantly need to be proven by some kind of enforcement or extraction from the external, as it were, or some kind of to keep on proving itself through some kind of test that has to be proffered or enforced, as it were. Again, I could have probably made these points much more rigorously, which they do sort of deserve. But I have roughly sketched it. But it's interesting because what I'm describing is a psychological uh, thing, and in some sense, I'm describing the malformation of an undeveloped psyche um, that then is trapped within a performative role, ironically, in its supposed wishing to gain mastery over performative roles. It has become super obsessed with them. And so you get this very interesting inversion of values, um, where supposedly the ideology allows one to transcend them. In practice, um, they have become enslaved by them. It's an irony on some level. And in some sense, the lack of that self awareness in terms of let's say that potential self diagnosis um, is again a symptom that is often projected onto the environment or redirected or diverted away from the self to take responsibility for it. Um, that might I mean obviously I can be pushed back on that as an existential overreach or something like that, or a metaphysical claim that is certainly unsettling, or as a kind of as a blanket complaint to make. I can only hope that I've sketched out my metaphysic well enough to make that apparent. But essentially, that is something like the nature of this problem of violating what I have kind of already described as a violation of the relativism paradox, which is that you're going to supposedly access a form of knowledge which I think actually doesn't validate the subjective perspective that it seeks to um, buttress, because it ends up displacing that subjective paradigm in such a um, categorical way, but it goes undetected because one thinks, oh, well, all forms of knowledge are equally accessible, or something like that, or oh, there's nothing wrong with putting on this hypothetical framework of that lets me think that I can garner knowledge of performative roles. But where am I standing to think about performative roles? I'm standing in the position of society, not as an individual within society. I'm standing in the place of looking at it from categories within society, not as an individual within those supposed categories. And so I'm making those categories essential. I'm making those categories, let's say, to be the highest category of moral consideration. And that is fundamentally invalid, is what I'm saying, is because they break discerning itself. They break it down into territory, into thematic distinctions, which don't are not commensurate with the nature of discerning itself, unless you're going to enslave your discerning slavishly to those being, let's say, a deeper metaphysic than the needs and the structure of discerning itself, which requires a level of forbidden knowledge in order to conserve itself, is kind of my general claim. Anyway, I think I've sketched it, so there's no point in continuing to reiterate. Yeah, so this is a small addendum. Yeah, so I think this is a general metaphor that kind of makes the point of what I was making, is that there are some categories of knowledge which can be reprocessed, used as an ingredient, and then you come up with an independent substantiation that then sort of eclipses the use of that. Like you're using it as a broad diagnosis tool, as an aspiration, as a placeholder, but you still need an independent substantiation from discerning in order to use it. That essentially there are some categories of knowledge which violate discerning by supplementing it, and therefore, in some sense, we can understand them to be like adjectives to discerning, and therefore they can have no stable existence as a category, in terms of, that we can talk about them as a category, as having this defect attached to them. Many people don't have this kind of intellectual sensitivity to this kind of category, and this is because of what I would call psychological sort of defects in their schema, in some sense, that it is the way of the world that people think that they can just kind of use their imagination as supplementary to their subjective immediate cognition and experience, that if they just kind of put a thought experiment around that, then because essentially that allows you to linguistically think that you're dealing with things that you understand that you don't understand. And when you think that you can access things hypothetically that you don't understand, that essentially you've just added an unknown quantity to your conclusion of that supposed thought experiment, which I would even say has not even been validly carried out. And I explored this in my other recordings. I don't know if I want to get into this tangent, because I was just trying to give a simple pass of this PARSE, a simple, sort of motif that summarizes this. But essentially, I don't know if I want to get into this tangent, but essentially, if I ask the question, can you imagine something that you do not understand, or can you imagine something that you cannot understand? The answer to both of those questions is no. You actually can't. But that's something that's better borne out in dialogue. Because essentially what you end up doing is you end up having to create a thought experiment within a thought experiment to think that you've done that. And at some point you haven't finished the thought experiment in which you supposedly have come across the thing that you do not or that you cannot understand, in order to say and to self-report that yes, you can do that. And if you do that, you realize that you've kind of subjected your truth to a filter of just being able to linguistically self-report it, but do you understand what you've actually said? And you become immune to uttering statements that are essentially you self-reporting or you issuing nonsense, that you do not understand your own nonsense, but because you can self-report it, then it makes it a truth claim, and then you've got a substituted formula for truth, which ends up essentially being projective, because now you're saying things that are not true because you think they're true because other people have to linguistically respect them, as it were. Um, and then essentially you've created a dominion within the world, as it were, in one of the principalities of the air. I'm quoting sort of scriptural language in this, but I think that essentially that is what the scriptures are essentially referring to. But uh, although I mean I can secularize this philosophy and say that it is found explicitly in epistemic responsibilism and perhaps in Nietzschean nihilism as well. You can kind of arrive at it in syntheses of both of those general camps, and I've got particular papers that I would fully endorse as roots into those subjects. But anyway, moving on. So essentially, there are some categories of knowledge that are effectively adjectives to discerning, and they have no stable weighting, truth weighting. Those adjectives are essentially fodder, chaff. They cannot have a stable truth claim to them because they are merely adjectives to discerning, because discerning is such a prominent feature of self-determinism, internal locus of control, free will, which, yeah, I guess this forces me to have to touch on those subjects. But essentially, so I mean, I've got some jargon which I will explain. That essentially, I mean, there are some things that govern discerning, some general rubric of knowledge and things like that, which I mean, which I would roughly in scriptural terms say, you know, you have to respect the Holy Ghost, which tells you that there is forbidden knowledge, and essentially knowledge of the Holy Ghost is knowledge of what is forbidden categorically or inaccessible to you, epistemologically, as an epistemic agent. So you're understanding the constitution of your epistemic agency, harmonizing all of this sort of jargon. But so essentially you have to understand that people are sentient, and that's also why we should have moral consideration for them, because they are containers of discerning, as it were. They are capable of discerning. This means that, well, sentience means that they have the capability of exercising free will, essentially. And how many people don't have free will. And that has to do with the state of their understanding. You have to have conceptual understanding in order to be able to create a schema that is capable of exercising free will, and many people's understandings and schemas don't reach that level. So they have relented their free will. Because their discerning is captive to some external locus of control, although when I say external here, I mean external to their discerning. So it includes metaphysical machination or mechanisms or formula that make them beholden to, let's say, a conditionality in which they demand some control and compliance and sort of to use as a meeting place. So that they lean on it as to support their understanding, and they need it enforced upon others to plug into in order to validate their methodological subservience of their undeveloped understanding. So, I mean, I would say, you know, the general formula of this is that people are enamored in, let's say, a cult of, or an idolatry of the adjective adjunct to the discerning, that essentially they use the adjective to know or to supposedly inflate a sense of the quality of the discerning, instead of understanding that, you know, adjectives to discerning are by their nature only as good as the agency, or are only, well, this is where my epistemic responsibilism comes in, and that is essentially that it's the agent, the epistemic agent, that is epistemic agency is the thing that is lending the credence the that is the substantiation of the truth claim. And therefore adjectives to discerning are by their very nature surreal. And in some sense we can say that they are awarded to us by the Holy Ghost. But we cannot access the rigor or the method that the Holy Ghost, you could say, we can know the style of how the Holy Ghost, as a category, performs its operation, in that it is that style is veiled to us. And so wishing to speak on behalf of the Holy Ghost is essentially is always some form of capture in some idolatry, in some worldly dominion that has a corrosive effect on the discerning, because it cannot ground the discerning, and in some sense it is abrogating the responsibility for the understanding to be prone to an external locus of control. Again, this could probably be espoused in a nicer, more rigorous sort of way, but at least I've actually sort of touched on everything. But yeah, I mean, it is possible to talk about this, removing all the scriptural language, but it is a useful metaphor in that, essentially, I mean, or actually, let me talk about this problem in terms of language itself. This actually also did come up in the discussion. Is that the thing is that language does belong to the collective. It doesn't belong to the individual. It doesn't belong to the self-determinism. And you are forced to use language in order to effect communication, which is actually what the individual is doing, is communicating. So communication belongs to the understanding, belongs to the discerning, but language does not, and that is our only medium. So we're stuck. Essentially, I want to have my understanding touch other people's understanding, but I have to use narrative as my conduit. And so I have to hope that the context of other people's understanding can be fished out of what I'm saying in some sense. And in some sense I can only know that if I discern that they have the same condition of mind that I have, in the same pursuit of refining our discerning, so that when we use this medium of narrative, that understanding is transmitted. But and there are also a lot of clues, essentially, in, let's say, non-verbal communication, that there's quite a high level of a sophisticated form of communication that doesn't even require language necessarily, but it does require a high degree of development in terms of discerning and understanding. So essentially, anyway, you end up understanding that the conduit, the medium, is not the message. That, when we use the heuristic that the medium is the message, we are actually sort of relegating ourselves to a kind of lowest common denominator way of the world, as it were, leaning towards the adjective, as it were, and not on the discerning. But we have to understand that this is what is to be transcended if we are to reclaim the dignity of being, the integrity of the agent, or of the essentially the thing that is to be dignified is discerning itself, is the understanding that that is our character, and that is the nexus and the seat of our character. And if we despoil it, then how do we not expect to be prone to toxic secondary? How can we not find ourselves subject to orders of secondary self-contradiction and so sometimes I think that people are experiencing somewhat the effects of their own maladministration of these first order categories, if I can put it thematically as such. And this is why I think that there is something to be garnered by because I mean many people will perhaps resonate with what I'm saying in some things, but then they have kind of compartmentalized their worldview into giving themselves permission in order to sort of unconsciously indulge haphazardly in this kind of buttressing from the adjective to discerning. And in some sense, one cannot guarantee that one is free of this, only that one will have one's eyes open to the enemy, and that one is open to being humble enough to have this pointed out to them, that everyone could perhaps, in the pursuit of this, that this is a pursuit that is part of the fidelity of discerning. That discerning is a process. It's a river that is always changing, and that essentially you don't get to kind of enter the same river twice. Is the basic metaphor, but you only get one discerning, and you can't sort of second guess it with categories of knowledge which condition it. It's void. What you're doing is a form of deep existential self-refutation, because you thought that you could garner knowledge about anything, but actually there are some things that are so important that that you have to understand before you just there has to be some form, some edifice in the pursuit of life, as it were. And it just so happens that now you've crossed the line that has a toxic systemic internal cascade failure, or something like that. And essentially that is the knowledge of the Holy Ghost, which is a practice in some sense, which is a knowledge which does not save you until it is a sort of a practiced observance, as it were, or the observance of the Holy Ghost is essentially a practice of knowing or understanding the treatment of forbidden knowledge. As an embodied unit which is required in order to operate as a holistic functional unit. So I mean, it is something about the boundary that protects the membrane of responsibility itself, as it were, or so it is the distinction that is required in order to create a holistic actualization of free will, as it were. So it is very much part of that. Where at least it's set. It categorically preserves it. Um, anyway, this is why essentially you need a sophistic metaphysics, and I explicitly rely on the Trinity, but I can sort of extol it in a secular understanding as well, but I'm using both because essentially because language is required in this way, because we need to make it a narrative before it becomes an understanding, essentially, that the mystery, well, first of all you have to regard it as a mystery, because then essentially that there's something there to be extracted from the mystery, that you don't understand it, but it holds your interest. So it's a mystery. So this is the necessity of mystery, that we cannot understand what is not first mysterious. Um, I mean, this is not necessarily true. It's probably more correct to say that essentially the garnering of understanding is the digestion of mystery, and perhaps you didn't know that it was mysterious until you had the understanding, and then you said, "Oh yes, actually, I was in a mystery," but that you can kind of that's from reverse engineering it, but essentially what holds your attention. I mean, so I guess they call it salience. I can't remember, like salience, pertinence, or something like that, um, or trying to understand what your salience, sort of trying to model or map your own sort of the qualia of your sensitivity in terms of salience. I think that this is also about perhaps bounding on one of these things, adjectives on discerning. I think it's kind of dangerous to have that kind of category of knowledge, because in some sense then you are gamifying your actual let's say pursuits of discerning. I mean, you can know that you can toy with those sorts of things, but there are things and so in some sense I'm not saying that they are, you can play with them, but you just have to know that, like, you can't live inside their framework, because they have and I think that a lot of people, some people I think intuitively know that it's sort of that it is a toy, and it's not uh, that it does unseat them, it does displace their it does challenge and let's say create this corrosion or whatever, but it is akin to being just merely an adjective to discerning. And again, I mean, yeah, so I'm just making the point that language itself has this built into it, that you have to go through the medium of narrative. Um, and I would like to maybe update. It's not that the medium is the message. I would rather say the medium is the mystery. And then life is essentially all the mystery in this sense then. And spiritual discerning, or discerning itself and understanding, is um, is the spiritual path of growth, as it were. Um, and then let me say as well that then if we understand phenomenologically that everything is a mystery that needs to be regulated by an understanding that transcends that mystery, or that finishes that mystery, or that overcomes it, so that it is anyway because well, that is the pursuit, and there's no other pursuit essentially, or that is the form in which any pursuit must take in order not to essentially. I mean, you look. There are choices of nature. You don't have to take that path, and but you see, then I vaguely in this context I asked the question: do you want to be a discerning individual? And if you say no, I don't. I want to dissolve the boundary between me and my environs. In my external is going to be a kind of is going to be a holism that I'm going to merge with the matrix, as it were. I'm going to merge with the mystery. I'm going to be at peace in the mystery. I'm going to live in an enchanted forest. I'm going to enjoy the adjective. I think that this is something, the adjective to discerning, and I think this is something that is in fact the forbidden fruit. I think this is the knowledge of good and evil. And you will become camouflaged. You will be like the serpent, in that you will be a part of the collective, a part of the world, camouflaged and covered and disguised within it. Anyway, I mean, I guess now I'm just making sort of a base scriptural sort of resonance or something like that. But essentially, the thing is that that kind of discerning, I believe, does undermine its own dignity, and it does, in principle, concede its own. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get into the point of explaining what loving the darkness is, and I actually get into this point. I repeat this point at the end of my last Trinity recording, so I'll just point to that rather than continue this on, because now I'm just getting further and further into my worldview. But yeah, I would point to that Trinity video in which I'm still getting my thoughts together at the beginning of the video, and then the addendum at the end I think is much more cogent. Also because I think I've come into a much clearer understanding of things once, having these discussions, but also because I've made some radical progress in my psychological research that I think has been able to heal myself through what I would generally call the technology of the crucifixion. But I need to make a recording on that. But anyway,